Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're journeying through the life of Marie Antoinette, the Austrian archduchess who became Queen of France and one of history's most misunderstood figures. Her story unfolds across the glittering halls of Versailles and the dark corridors of revolutionary Paris, carrying us through a world of impossible beauty and impossible tragedy. We'll explore where her journey began in the palaces of Vienna, how she navigated the treacherous waters of French court life, and how the tides of revolution swept away everything she had known. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time is it for you. Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. Now, let's begin. The air in Vienna carried the scent of apple blossoms and wood smoke on the November morning when Maria Antonia Josefa Johanna was born. The year was 1755. The city spread beneath the windows of Schönbrunn Palace like a living tapestry, its streets narrow and winding, its rooftops catching the pale autumn light. Inside the palace, in rooms where silk curtains filtered the sun into honey-colored streams, Empress Maria Theresa held her newest daughter and understood immediately that this child would serve Austria in ways that had nothing to do with personal happiness. The palace itself seemed to breathe with the weight of empire. 1,400 rooms stretched in all directions, each one a statement of Habsburg power that had endured for centuries. The walls were covered in panels painted with scenes from mythology, gods and goddesses frozen in moments of eternal grace. The floors were marble, cool even in summer, polished until they reflected the chandeliers above like still water, reflecting stars. When servants walked these corridors, their footsteps whispered against stone that had known the passage of emperors and empresses stretching back through time. In the nursery where young Maria Antonia spent her earliest years, the windows looked out over gardens that had been designed to display nature perfected by human will. The series cut into geometric precision-lined paths of white gravel that crunched satisfyingly underfoot. Fountains sent water arcing into the air where it caught the light and fell again in patterns that seemed almost musical. On warm days, the scent of roses drifted through open windows, mixing with the beeswax used to polish the furniture until it glowed. The child grew in this world of careful beauty, learning without words that everything around her existed to demonstrate power and permanence. The paintings on the walls showed ancestors whose faces had been arranged into expressions of dignified authority. The furniture had been carved by craftsmen whose entire lives had been devoted to creating objects that would outlast them by centuries. Even the toys placed in her small hands were made from materials chosen to teach lessons about value and rarity. Ivory and jade and gold worked into shapes that delighted while reminding her of what she represented. Her mother, the Empress Maria Theresa, moved through the palace like a force of nature contained in silk and jewels. She had survived wars that should have destroyed Austria, had held together an empire that spoke a dozen languages and worshipped in different ways, had transformed personal grief into political strength. When she looked at her daughter Maria Antonia, she saw not just a child but a diplomatic instrument that could secure peace between Austria and its ancient enemy France. This understanding shaped every decision about how the girl would be raised, what she would learn, who she would become. The education that began in those early years focused not on scholarship, but on the arts of pleasing others. Maria Antonia learned to move with a grace that seemed effortless, to hold her body in ways that conveyed both dignity and approachability. She practiced the clavichord until her fingers could draw music from the keys that made listeners forget to breathe. She studied French pronunciation with tutors who corrected the slightest imperfection, understanding that her accent would be scrutinized by people looking for reasons to dismiss her as a foreigner. The dancing lessons took place in rooms where mirrors covered entire walls, forcing the child to watch herself learning to become someone else. The dancing master, a Frenchman brought to Vienna specifically for this purpose, taught her steps that told stories without words. A curtsy could convey respect or submission or gracious acknowledgement, depending on how deeply she bent, how long she held the position, how she raised her eyes as she straightened. A turn could suggest joy or dismissal, or invitation based on the angle of her shoulders and the speed of her movement. Through all these lessons ran the understanding that her personal desires mattered less than the needs of Austria. She learned this not through stern lectures but through the thousand small ways that her preferences were noted and then gently redirected. When she showed interest in books that her tutors considered unsuitable, other volumes appeared in their place. When she formed attachments to particular servants or companions, Those people were quietly reassigned. The message was clear, though never spoken harshly. She belonged not to herself but to the empire that had given her birth. The rooms where she took her meals taught their own lessons about hierarchy and ceremony. The table was set with porcelain so fine you could see light through it, each piece painted with flowers or landscapes by artists who had spent years perfecting their craft. The silver reflected faces with such clarity that you could read expressions in the rounded surfaces of serving spoons. The food arrived in procession, each course announced and presented according to protocols that had been established by her ancestors and must not be altered. Yet beneath this formal grandeur, Marie Antoinette remained a child who laughed easily and loved music and showed kindness to the servants who attended her. Her natural warmth created complicated feelings in those who knew her best. They recognized that this openness would serve her well in some ways, making her likable and approachable. But they also worried that it might make her vulnerable to manipulation by those who would use her genuine affection against Austria's interests. The news that she would marry the French Dauphin arrived when she was 13, though the negotiations had been proceeding for years. In the private apartments where her mother explained what this marriage would mean, the air felt thick despite open windows. Maria Theresa spoke of duty and opportunity, of how this union would prevent another war that could devastate both empires. She did not speak of love or happiness, or the loneliness that came from being forever separated from everything familiar. The preparation for her transformation from Austrian archduchess to French dauphin began immediately and proceeded with systematic thoroughness. French became not just a language she studied, but the language she must think in, dream in, become in. Her Austrian clothes were set aside in favor of French fashions that felt strange on her body, the fabrics heavier or lighter than what she knew, cut to different proportions that changed how she moved. She practiced eating French foods prepared by French cooks, learning to appreciate flavors that seemed foreign to a palate formed by Austrian kitchens. The most profound changes, though, happened in ways that left no visible trace. She learned to shape her face into expressions that would be read as French rather than Austrian. She practiced gestures that would convey meanings understood by French courtiers without seeming studied or artificial. She absorbed lessons about French history and French sensibilities, learning to view the world through eyes that no longer saw Austria as home but as the foreign country she was leaving behind. The farewell ceremonies in Vienna were designed to emphasize the finality of her departure. In rooms where she had spent her childhood, courtiers gathered to witness her formal renunciation of her Austrian identity. She stood in a gown of white silk embroidered with flowers that had taken seamstresses months to complete, each petal rendered in threads of silver that caught the candlelight. The weight of the fabric helped hold her upright as she spoke the words that separated her from everything she had known. The journey to France took weeks, with elaborate ceremonies at every significant stop. These events were calculated to introduce the future queen to her new subjects while also demonstrating Austrian wealth and French magnificence. At each town, local nobles gathered to pay their respects, their faces a blur of polite attention that revealed little about their true feelings. She smiled and thanked them in French that was now flawless, playing her part in this elaborate theater of diplomacy. At the island in the Rhine that marked the border between the two empires, she underwent the ceremony that would haunt her memory for years to come. A wooden building had been constructed specifically for this purpose, divided precisely down the middle so that one half stood in Austrian territory and the other in France. She entered from the Austrian side accompanied by Austrian attendants, walking across floors that creaked slightly under the weight of her heavy gown. In a room hung with tapestries showing scenes of peaceful prosperity, she was required to remove every article of Austrian clothing, every piece of Austrian jewelry, every object that connected her to her past. She stood in simple undergarments while French ladies in waiting dressed her in French clothes, the fabric cool against her skin. The symbolism was unmistakable. The Austrian archduchess had ceased to exist. In her place stood the French dauphin, a creature created entirely for French purposes. She emerged from the French side of the building as Marie Antoinette. The Austrian softness of her birth name hardened into French phonemes. The carriages waiting to transport her to Versailles were more magnificent than anything she had seen in Austria, gilded so heavily they seemed made of solid gold. The horses wore plumes that nodded with each step, their harnesses jingling a rhythm that accompanied her deeper into her new country. The roads to Versailles wound through countryside that looked both familiar and strange to eyes accustomed to Austrian landscapes. The fields here seemed flatter, the villages more prosperous, the churches built in styles that spoke of different histories and different relationships between faith and power. More people gathered along the route to see their future queen, their faces showing curiosity and something harder to name. She waved to them as she had been taught, her hand moving in the precise arc that conveyed gracious acknowledgement. When Versailles finally appeared on the horizon, it took her breath away in ways that had nothing to do with beauty. The palace stretched wider than seemed possible for a single building, its windows catching the afternoon sun and throwing it back in dazzling sheets of light. The gardens that surrounded it had been carved from nature with such determination that they seemed to deny the existence of anything wild or uncontrolled. This was a landscape of pure human will, every tree and flower existing only because someone had decided it should exist in exactly that place. The courtyards through which her carriage passed were filled with people who had come to witness her arrival, their faces blurred together, thousands of pairs of eyes watching her with expressions she could not read. She kept her own face arranged in the serene smile she had practiced, though her hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that her fingers ached. The carriage stopped before steps that led upward toward doors that stood open like a mouth waiting to swallow her. Inside, the palace revealed itself as even more overwhelming than its exterior had promised. The entrance hall rose 3 stories high, its walls covered in marble panels that had been cut and fitted with such precision that the joints were nearly invisible. Statues of gods and heroes stood in niches, their stone faces expressing emotions that seemed more real than the carefully controlled expressions of the courtiers who lined the walls. The Hall of Mirrors, when she was finally led into it, stunned her into momentary silence. 17 tall arches held windows that looked out over gardens stretching toward the horizon. Opposite each window, a mirror of exactly the same size and shape doubled the light and created the illusion that the room extended infinitely in both directions. Chandeliers hung from the painted ceiling, their crystals catching every source of light and breaking it into rainbows that danced across the white marble floor. Here, in this room designed to demonstrate that France possessed power without limit, she was presented to the king. Louis XV was an old man by then, his face marked by years of excess that had been considered his royal prerogative. He looked at her with eyes that assessed without warmth, seeing not a frightened 14-year-old girl but a diplomatic acquisition that might prove useful. He spoke words of welcome that sounded rehearsed, touched her hand with fingers that felt dry as paper, and then moved on to the next item of ceremonial business. The Dauphin, the young man she had traveled so far to marry, stood beside his grandfather with an expression that suggested he would rather be anywhere else. Louis Auguste was 16, awkward in his own body, more interested in mechanical devices than in the social graces that made court life bearable. When he looked at her, she saw neither attraction nor rejection, only a kind of resigned acceptance that this marriage was as inevitable for him as it was for her. The wedding ceremony that followed days later was magnificent in ways that made her previous life in Vienna seem almost simple. The chapel at Versailles had been decorated with thousands of flowers, their scent so heavy in the warm air that some of the ladies in waiting. Her wedding gown was so elaborate that it required 3 attendants just to arrange the train, which stretched behind her like a river of embroidered silk. The weight of the fabric, the tightness of the bodice, the press of the jeweled crown on her head, all combined to make her feel as if she were being buried in magnificence. Ceremony proceeded according to protocols that had been established centuries earlier, every word and gesture predetermined, leaving no room for spontaneity or authentic emotion. She spoke her vows in French that no longer felt foreign, making promises to a young man whose hand felt clammy in hers. Around them, thousands of courtiers watched with faces that revealed nothing, while outside the palace, crowds gathered to celebrate a union that was supposed to guarantee peace between empires. The wedding night that followed was a disaster that would cast a shadow over her entire marriage. The Dauphin's inability to consummate their union created immediate political problems that transformed private humiliation into public scandal. In a world where royal marriages existed primarily to produce heirs, this failure was not merely personal but potentially catastrophic for both French succession and the diplomatic alliance that depended on Habsburg grandchildren strengthening ties between the two empires. The months that followed taught Marie Antoinette that she had entered a world far more complex and dangerous than anything she had known in Austria. Versailles was not simply a palace but a complete society unto itself, housing thousands of people whose entire existence revolved around proximity to royal power. The courtiers who surrounded her were not merely decorative figures but sophisticated political actors whose fortunes depended on their ability to influence royal decisions and gain access to the patronage that flowed from the throne. Every conversation carried multiple meanings, every gesture was observed and interpreted, every friendship concealed potential betrayal. She navigated this world with the openness that was natural to her temperament, completely unprepared for the sophisticated deceptions that governed daily interactions. So the failure, Austrian honesty, which should have been an asset, became a liability in a court that rewarded manipulation and punished naivete. The failure of her marriage to produce children created a crisis that grew more severe with each passing month. In whispered conversations that reached her ears through servants who pitied her, courtiers speculated about whether she was barren, whether the Dauphin was impotent, whether the entire alliance between France and Austria was cursed by forces beyond human control. These rumors, seemingly innocent gossip, were actually calculated political weapons used by factions who saw advantage in undermining her position. Her response to these pressures revealed both her resilience and her fundamental misunderstanding of her situation. Rather than retreating into dignified silence, she threw herself into the social life of Versailles with desperate enthusiasm. She danced until dawn at balls where candlelight turned the mirrors into pools of gold. She gambled at cards with stakes that would have fed entire villages, laughing at losses that meant nothing to someone who had never known financial constraint. She surrounded herself with companions who shared her love of pleasure and her apparent indifference to the growing economic crisis that was pushing France toward the precipice. This behavior, natural for someone of her age and circumstances, proved catastrophic for her public image. French subjects struggling to afford bread could not comprehend why their future queen seemed to spend every moment in pursuit of entertainment. The contrast between royal extravagance and popular suffering became too obvious to ignore, creating resentments that would eventually explode into revolutionary fury. The Petit Trianon, her private retreat within the grounds of Versailles, became the ultimate symbol of her supposed disconnection from reality. This small palace, which she had begged the king to give her as a refuge from the suffocating ceremonial of court life, was actually quite modest by aristocratic standards. But to critics who wanted to believe the worst about her, it represented unlimited royal greed consuming resources desperately needed elsewhere. The gardens surrounding the Petit Trianon revealed her genuine longing for something more authentic than the artificial perfection that characterized Versailles. She commissioned landscapes that imitated natural countryside, with winding streams and irregular plantings that contrasted dramatically with the geometric precision of the main palace gardens. In these spaces, she could walk without feeling constantly observed, could sit beneath trees that had been allowed to grow in shapes determined by nature rather than human will. The famous hameau, the mock village she created near the Petit Trianon, would become the most notorious symbol of her supposed frivolity. This collection of rustic cottages, where she and her friends could play at being shepherdesses, seemed to epitomize aristocratic delusion about the realities of rural life. The perfectly maintained buildings, the carefully bred livestock, the servants dressed as peasants who performed actual labor while she pretended, all of this created an image of royal mockery that her enemies exploited mercilessly. Yet the hameau revealed something more complex than simple frivolity. Marie Antoinette's pastoral fantasies reflected genuine attraction to the simple, natural life that Enlightenment philosophers had celebrated as morally superior to artificial court existence. Her desire to milk cows and gather eggs represented sincere longing for the uncomplicated authenticity that her position made impossible. She was trapped between worlds, unable to be truly royal in the ways that French tradition demanded, yet equally unable to escape the gilded cage that defined her existence. The birth of her first child in 1778 finally provided the political security she had desperately needed for 8 years, yet even this joyous event exposed her to new forms of criticism. The elaborate ceremonies surrounding the birth, designed to demonstrate that the Queen had fulfilled her most important duty, also highlighted the grotesque artificiality of royal life. The Queen's labor and delivery were witnessed by dozens of courtiers, whose presence transformed an intimate human experience into political theatre. The child, Princess Marie-Therese Charlotte, was welcomed with genuine relief by the royal family, but her gender created new anxieties about the succession. French law required male heirs, meaning Marie Antoinette would need to produce sons to truly secure her position. The pressure of these expectations, combined with the continuing difficulties in her marriage to Louis Auguste, created stresses that affected both her health and her judgment. When a son, the Dauphin Louis-Joseph, was finally born in 1781, it should have resolved all questions about her value to France. Instead, it intensified the political pressures she faced. The existence of a male heir made the monarchy's future secure, but it also made the queen expendable. She was no longer essential for dynastic continuity, making her vulnerable if circumstances required a scapegoat for France's mounting problems. The diamond necklace affair of 1785 destroyed whatever remained of her reputation among the French people. This elaborate fraud, which she had absolutely nothing to do with, seemed to confirm every accusation that had been made about her character and priorities. The necklace itself was a monument to excess, containing over 600 diamonds worth more than the annual income of thousands of families. The fact that people believed she would secretly commission such an object while France struggled with bankruptcy revealed how completely her public image had been poisoned. The trial that followed created a spectacle that transformed a criminal proceeding into a referendum on monarchy itself. Cardinal de Rohan's defense strategy required portraying the queen as so corrupt that his naive trust seemed reasonable rather than foolish. The testimony given during the proceedings painted Marie Antoinette as frivolous, deceitful, and obsessed with luxury to the point of recklessness. Her innocence became irrelevant compared to what people were prepared to believe about her character. As France's financial crisis deepened into existential threat, Marie Antoinette found herself blamed for problems that had been building for decades. Every past expenditure was scrutinized, every piece of jewelry examined, every entertainment calculated and added to accounts that portrayed her as personally responsible for national bankruptcy. The reality that her spending represented a tiny fraction of the actual causes of French debt mattered less than the symbolic power of blaming the foreign queen for all of France's troubles. The convening of the Estates General in 1789 opened the floodgates to revolutionary change that would sweep away everything she had known. As representatives from across France gathered to address the kingdom's crisis, their lists of grievances repeatedly mentioned the queen as a symbol of everything that needed reforming. Her name had become synonymous with corruption and foreign interference, making her the perfect target for revolutionary anger seeking concrete objects to blame for abstract problems. The October days, when Parisian women marched to Versailles, demanding bread and forcing the royal family back to Paris, marked the end of Marie Antoinette's life as she had known it. The magnificent palace that had been her home became a museum of royal excess, while she found herself a prisoner in the Tuileries Palace, watched constantly by revolutionary guards who viewed her as a potential enemy of the people. The flight to Versailles in June 1791 represented her most desperate attempt to escape. This carefully planned journey toward the Austrian border, where her family might have found safety and support, failed because of a combination of bad luck and poor judgment. Their capture and humiliating return to Paris transformed the queen from a political prisoner into an active enemy of the revolution in the eyes of French public opinion. The war between France and Austria placed Marie Antoinette in an impossible position. As French queen, she was expected to support her adopted country. As Austrian archduchess, she naturally hoped for Austrian victory that might restore her family. Revolutionary propagandists exploited this divided loyalty to portray her as a traitor, actively collaborating with foreign enemies. The storming of the Tuileries in August 1792 ended any pretense that the monarchy retained authority. The brutal massacre of guards who tried to protect the royal family demonstrated that revolutionary violence had reached levels that made reconciliation impossible. Her survival of this attack only ensured she would face more serious charges in whatever legal proceedings followed. Imprisonment in the Temple Tower stripped away the last vestiges of royal ceremony. The medieval fortress that became their prison was chosen specifically for its associations with royal captivity. Life in these simple rooms, with plain furniture and basic meals, represented deliberate rejection of the luxury that revolutionaries associated with aristocratic oppression. The execution of Louis XVI in January 1793 eliminated any hope for negotiated settlement. His death made her situation desperate in ways that transcended personal grief, demonstrating that revolutionary justice was prepared to eliminate monarchy completely rather than simply limiting its power. The separation from her children represented perhaps the cruelest aspect of her final imprisonment. The maternal instincts that had given her purpose during her darkest months were deliberately frustrated by captors who understood that psychological torture was more effective than physical abuse. Her trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal was political theater rather than legal proceeding. The charges ranged from treason to corruption of her children with counter-revolutionary ideas. Her guilt regarding these accusations was predetermined by a tribunal created to eliminate enemies rather than administer justice. Her behavior during the trial revealed the transformation that captivity had produced. The frivolous young woman obsessed with fashion had been replaced by someone who faced death with remarkable composure. Her calm dignity during the proceedings impressed even hostile observers who had expected either defiance or desperation. Her final letter, written to Madame Elizabeth on the morning of her execution, demonstrated forgiveness that contrasted sharply with the hatred that had driven her destruction. This document revealed spiritual depths that had been invisible during her years of apparent superficiality. The journey to the scaffold, through Parisian streets, provided her final confrontation with the popular hatred that had been building for decades. The crowds that gathered represented the triumph of revolutionary justice, but also the violent extremism that would ultimately consume the revolution itself. Her execution on October 16, 1793. Eliminated not just an individual but a symbol of royal authority that had shaped European political culture for centuries. The death of Marie Antoinette represented complete victory of revolutionary ideology over traditional monarchical principles, establishing precedents that would influence political development throughout the modern world. So the tale of Marie Antoinette comes to us across the centuries, carried in countless retellings that continue to find new meanings in her remarkable life. The teenage archduchess who left Vienna with such hope could never have imagined that her name would continue inspiring fascination. Her legacy reminds us that beneath grand titles and glittering circumstances lie universal truths about courage, dignity, and the enduring power of the human spirit when tested by circumstances beyond personal control. Tonight, as you drift toward peaceful rest, may you carry with you the image of a young woman who faced her destiny with grace, who found strength in her darkest hours, who demonstrated that true nobility lies not in the accidents of birth but in how we choose to meet the challenges that life presents to us all. The mirrors of Versailles may stand empty now, but the woman who once walked those halls continues to teach us about maintaining humanity, regardless of the forces that seek to diminish it. Her journey from privilege to persecution reminds us that history is shaped not just by abstract forces, but by real people whose choices and sufferings continue to illuminate what it means to be human. Sleep well, dear friend, knowing that her story has completed its gentle arc through your consciousness this evening, leaving behind reflections about power and vulnerability, public perception and private truth that will settle softly into your dreams like snow falling on a winter garden at twilight. The stone walls of the conciergerie still stand beside the sign, their foundations reaching down into earth that has absorbed centuries of human sorrow and resilience. The cell where Marie Antoinette spent her final weeks measured roughly 12 feet by 10, with walls so thick that sounds from the outside world arrived muted and distorted, as if filtering through water. A small window set high in the wall allowed pale light to enter during daylight hours, illuminating dust motes that drifted through the air like tiny spirits suspended between earth and sky. The furnishings in this final chamber were deliberately simple, chosen to demonstrate the complete reversal of her former circumstances. A narrow bed with straw mattress and rough wool blanket occupied one corner. A wooden chair with uneven legs stood beside a plain table scarred by years of use. A chamber pot in the corner served as the only concession to basic human needs. The floor was stone, cold even in summer, damp always with moisture that seeped up from the river running beneath the prison foundations. In this space, stripped of all comfort and dignity, Marie Antoinette discovered resources of character that had remained hidden during her years of apparent frivolity at Versailles. The woman who had once required dozens of attendants to help her dress now managed with clothing so simple it could be put on and removed without assistance. The queen, who had never walked anywhere without ceremony, now paced the narrow confines of her cell with steps measured to conserve energy while maintaining some semblance of physical activity. Her guards watched her constantly through a small opening in the door, their eyes following her movements with suspicion born of revolutionary ideology that taught them to view aristocrats as inherently dangerous conspirators. These men, most of them from working-class backgrounds that made Versailles seem like a distant planet, struggled to reconcile the thin, aging woman before them with the monster they had been taught to fear and hate. Some found themselves experiencing unexpected sympathy, which they suppressed as weakness that threatened their revolutionary commitment. The routine of prison life established its own rhythms that replaced the elaborate ceremonies that had once structured every moment of her existence. She woke when pale light began filtering through the high window, rising from her straw mattress with joints that ached from the dampness in the thin bedding. Simple food arrived twice daily, bread and broth that bore no resemblance to the elaborate meals that had once been served to her on porcelain plates worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. She ate slowly, making each meal last, understanding that the process of eating provided structure to hours that otherwise stretched empty and endless. The silence in her cell felt different from any quiet she had known before. At Versailles, silence had been impossible. With thousands of people moving through corridors, their footsteps and conversations creating a constant background hum of human activity. Even in her private apartments, sounds had filtered through walls and doors, reminding her always that she lived surrounded by others. Here, the silence was profound, broken only by occasional footsteps in the corridor outside, the distant sound of the river, and her own breathing that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. She spent hours sitting motionless on the wooden chair, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes focused on nothing in particular. To observers peering through the door opening, she might have appeared to be simply waiting, passive and defeated. But in the privacy of her own mind, she was engaged in work far more demanding than any she had undertaken during her years as queen. She was reviewing her entire life, examining choices and consequences, with honesty that had been impossible when she was surrounded by people whose livelihoods depended on flattering her and confirming her assumptions. The memories came to her unbidden, rising from depths she had not known existed. She remembered her mother's face during their final meeting in Vienna, the careful control of expression that had not quite hidden Maria Theresa's tears. She recalled the journey to France, the careful shedding of her Austrian identity like a snake slipping free of old skin that no longer fit. The wedding ceremony came back to her with clarity that made her catch her breath. The weight of her gown, the smell of flowers so thick it had made her dizzy, the touch of Louis August's clammy hand in hers. The early years at Versailles appeared in her memory as a confusion of faces and ceremony, of trying desperately to understand rules that everyone else seemed to know instinctively while she stumbled through each day, making mistakes that were noted and remembered and used against her later. She saw herself as others must have seen her, a young girl trying too hard to please, her eagerness interpreted as manipulation, her genuine warmth dismissed as calculated charm designed to disguise her foreign origins and suspect loyalties. The birth of her children returned to her with particular vividness, the pain and fear and overwhelming joy that had accompanied each arrival. She remembered holding Marie Therese for the first time, this tiny creature who depended entirely on her care, and feeling a love so fierce it frightened her with its intensity. The arrival of Louis Joseph, the son who would secure the succession, had brought relief mixed with renewed pressure to fulfill her role as mother of future kings. Each subsequent birth had added layers of meaning and responsibility that she had tried to carry with varying degrees of success. Her relationship with her children had provided the only completely authentic aspect of her life as queen. With them she could simply be a mother, responding to their needs without calculating political implications or worrying about how her actions would be interpreted by hostile observers. She had read to them from books about faraway places, had played games that made them laugh, had comforted them when they were frightened or hurt. These memories sustained her now, providing evidence that her life had contained genuine meaning beyond the artificial ceremonies and political calculations that had consumed so much of her time and energy. The separation from her children represented the deepest wound of her captivity. She did not know where they were, how they were being treated, whether they were frightened or in pain. The uncertainty was worse than any physical suffering she endured herself. She would gladly have traded any comfort, accepted any hardship, if only she could know that her children were safe and cared for with some measure of kindness. The long hours alone in her cell forced her to confront truths about herself that she had avoided during the distractions of court life. She recognized now how little she had understood about the country she had been sent to rule. The poverty that had driven ordinary French families to desperation had been invisible from Versailles, where abundance seemed as natural and limitless as air. The resentments that had been building among people struggling to survive had not penetrated the bubble of privilege that surrounded her, leaving her genuinely bewildered when revolutionary anger finally exploded. She understood, too, that her spending, while modest compared to previous queens and justified by the ceremonial obligations of her position, had provided perfect ammunition for enemies who needed a simple explanation for complex economic problems. The diamond necklace affair, despite her complete innocence, had confirmed everything people wanted to believe about her character. Her protestations of ignorance had seemed like lies because they contradicted a narrative that made sense of suffering that otherwise had no clear cause or solution. The correspondence she had maintained with her brother Leopold came back to haunt her in these quiet hours. The letters she had written seeking help for her family had been acts of desperation, not treason. But she could see now how they would appear to people who viewed her Austrian origins as permanent evidence of divided loyalty. She had never truly become French in the eyes of her subjects, remaining always the foreigner, whose presence reminded them of diplomatic calculations that placed European power politics above their welfare. Her relationship with Louis had been another casualty of circumstances beyond either of their control. He had been as unprepared for kingship as she had been for queenship, thrust into roles that required abilities and temperaments neither possessed. Their failure to produce children for years had created a crisis that transformed private difficulties into public scandal. The eventual arrival of heirs had resolved the succession crisis, but had not repaired the damage to their relationship or to her reputation. She thought about the women who had marched to Versailles demanding bread, their faces twisted by hunger and anger that she had not understood even as she faced it directly. They had seen her as the enemy, as the source of their suffering, as the obstacle that stood between them and justice. She could not blame them for this belief, which had been fed by years of propaganda that portrayed her as a monster of selfishness and cruelty. But she wished desperately that she could have made them understand that she had never intended their suffering, had never even comprehended its extent. The nights in her cell were the hardest times, when darkness made the stone walls seem to press closer, and the sounds of the prison took on qualities that set her nerves on edge. She could hear other prisoners crying out in dreams or prayers, their voices carrying through the thick walls in ways that suggested the building itself was haunted by accumulated suffering. She lay on her straw mattress, pulling the thin blanket close against the chill that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with fear of what awaited her. Sleep, when it came, brought dreams that mixed memory with imagination in ways that left her unsure what had been real and what her mind had created to fill the emptiness. She dreamed of Vienna, of running through gardens where the hedges had not yet been trimmed into submission, where flowers grew wild and sweet. She dreamed of her children as babies, their skin soft and warm, their small hands gripping her fingers with surprising strength. She dreamed of dancing at Versailles, the music swelling around her, the mirrors multiplying her reflection into infinity. But she also dreamed of the crowds at Varennes, their faces filled with hatred, so pure it seemed like a force of nature. She dreamed of the Tuileries being stormed, the sounds of violence echoing through corridors that had once known only the rustle of silk and the murmur of polite conversation. She dreamed of her husband's execution, though she had not witnessed it, her sleeping mind creating images that were worse than reality because they were shaped by her deepest fears rather than actual events. The arrival of her defense attorney, Claude Chauveau-Lagarde, broke the monotony of her captivity, while also making her fate seem more immediate and inescapable. He was a conscientious man who took his responsibility seriously despite understanding that the outcome of her trial had been predetermined. He explained the charges against her with patient thoroughness, his voice gentle as he described accusations that ranged from the plausible to the absurd. She listened to his explanations with the same calm attention she brought to everything now, her emotional responses dampened by months of fear and uncertainty that had exhausted her capacity for extreme feeling. When he told her she was accused of depleting the national treasury, she nodded without protest, understanding that her actual expenditures were irrelevant compared to her symbolic usefulness as a scapegoat. When he described accusations of treasonous correspondence with foreign enemies, she acknowledged the letters she had written while maintaining they had been desperate pleas for help rather than calculated betrayal. The most painful accusations concerned her children, particularly claims that she had corrupted her son with counter-revolutionary ideas. She defended herself against these charges with more vigor than she showed regarding any others, her voice rising slightly as she insisted she had only wanted her children to understand their heritage and responsibilities. The thought that her maternal love could be twisted into evidence of political crime hurt more deeply than any attack on her character or conduct. The preparation for trial forced her to confront the reality that her life was measured now in days rather than years or decades. She used the time to write letters to family members who might survive her, choosing words carefully to express love and forgiveness without providing additional ammunition for those who sought to condemn her memory along with her person. Her letter to Madame Elizabeth, which would become famous for its expression of Christian charity toward enemies, went through several drafts as she struggled to find language that captured both her grief and her hard-won acceptance of her fate. The writing was difficult in her cell, where light was poor and her hands often trembled from cold or emotion. She formed each letter carefully, aware that these words might be the last communication she would have with people she loved. She apologized for failings she recognized in herself, expressed gratitude for kindnesses she had received, and offered forgiveness to those who had wronged her. The act of writing these sentiments helped her believe them, transforming aspirations toward grace into actual spiritual achievement through the discipline of putting them into words. The night before her trial, she slept hardly at all, lying on her straw mattress, while her mind raced through everything that had brought her to this moment. She was 37 years old, but felt ancient, worn down by years of pressure and fear and loss. The face that had once been celebrated for its beauty was gaunt now, marked by suffering that had aged her beyond her years. Her hair, which had been a source of pride and endless attention, had turned white from stress, the color leaching out as if her body were already preparing for death. When guards came to take her to the tribunal, she rose with the same dignity that had characterized all her movements during these final months. She dressed in the simple white garments that had been provided, refusing to see them as a shroud though others might interpret them that way. White had always been her color, the shade she wore to signify purity and new beginnings. If it would serve for her ending as well, there was a symmetry in that which pleased her aesthetic sense. The journey through the prison corridors to the courtroom felt longer than her trip from Vienna to Versailles had been. Each step carried her closer to judgment that she knew would be harsh regardless of evidence or arguments presented in her defense. The guards around her maintained expressions of professional neutrality, but she could sense their discomfort with their task. So whatever propaganda had taught them about aristocratic monsters, the reality of escorting a thin, aging woman to almost certain death created moral complications they had not anticipated. The courtroom was packed with spectators who had come to witness history being made through her destruction. Their faces showed curiosity more than hatred. The expression of people watching a spectacle they knew was significant but did not fully understand. She took her place in the defendant's chair with movements that remained graceful despite exhaustion and fear, arranging her simple skirts with the same attention to detail she had once brought to elaborate court costumes. The charges read against her sounded almost absurd in their comprehensiveness, as if the revolutionary tribunal had collected every rumor and accusation that had circulated about her over 2 decades and decided to prosecute them all simultaneously. She was blamed for influencing her husband toward policies that favored Austria over France, for maintaining treasonous correspondence, for squandering public money on personal luxuries, for attempting to flee France to organize foreign invasions, for corrupting her children with counter-revolutionary ideology. As she listened to these accusations, she realized that she was being tried not for specific actions she had taken but for her entire existence. Every choice she had made, every word she had spoken, every relationship she had formed, had been examined through lenses of suspicion that transformed even innocent actions into evidence of malicious intent. Her guilt had been established before any evidence was presented, making the trial itself merely theater designed to provide moral justification for a political necessity. The witnesses called against her included former servants who had worked in the royal household, their testimony revealing years of surveillance that had documented her daily routines, her private conversations, her personal relationships. These people, some of whom she barely remembered, provided details about her life that should have been private. Their words painted a picture of someone obsessed with pleasure and luxury, indifferent to the suffering of French people, actively working to undermine French interests in favor of Austrian ambitions. She recognized that many of these witnesses had been coerced or incentivized to testify against her, their statements shaped more by fear for their own safety than by accurate memory of events. Some had clearly been coached to provide testimony that confirmed revolutionary assumptions about her character and conduct. Others seemed genuinely to believe the interpretations they offered, having absorbed propaganda about her wickedness so thoroughly that they could no longer distinguish between what they had actually observed and what they had been taught to see. The few witnesses who attempted to speak in her defense faced immediate suspicion about their own political loyalties. Their testimony was dismissed as evidence of continued aristocratic conspiracy rather than honest evaluation of her character. The Revolutionary Tribunal had created a legal environment where defending the accused was itself considered proof of political crime, making genuine justice impossible within the ideological framework that governed the proceedings. When given opportunity to respond to the charges, Marie Antoinette spoke with clarity that impressed even hostile observers. She acknowledged mistakes and regrets while maintaining her innocence of the specific crimes alleged. Her voice remained steady as she explained that her correspondence with her brother had been the desperate appeal of a sister seeking help for her family, not calculated treason against France. She defended her spending as necessary to fulfill ceremonial obligations that had been imposed on her rather than chosen by her. She insisted with particular vigor that her love for her children and desire to educate them properly could not reasonably be construed as corruption of their values. Her composure throughout the trial created problems for prosecutors who had expected either defiant arrogance or pathetic pleading. The dignity with which she faced accusations of capital crimes suggested depths of character that contradicted the simple narrative of frivolous wickedness that revolutionary propaganda had constructed. Some spectators found themselves experiencing unexpected sympathy, which troubled them because it suggested that revolutionary justice might be more complicated and morally ambiguous than they had been taught to believe. The verdict, when it came, surprised no one who understood the political purposes the trial was designed to serve. Marie Antoinette was found guilty of conspiracy against the liberty of the nation and sentenced to death by guillotine. The judges who pronounced this sentence understood they were participating in ritual that would transform French political culture by demonstrating that no individual, regardless of birth or former status, stood above the justice of the people. She received the verdict without visible reaction, her face arranged in the same expression of calm acceptance she had maintained throughout the trial. Inside, she felt a mixture of relief that uncertainty had ended and grief for everything she would lose, everyone she would never see again. But she had moved beyond the point where external circumstances could shake the equilibrium she had achieved through months of preparation for this moment. She had made peace with her fate in the quiet hours alone in her cell, finding spiritual resources that sustained her now when they were most desperately needed. The brief time between sentencing and execution passed in a blur of final preparations and farewells. She was allowed to write letters to family members, though she understood these might never be delivered. She composed a final message to Madame Elizabeth that expressed the forgiveness and acceptance she had worked so hard to achieve. The words came more easily than they had in previous drafts, as if the reality of imminent death had clarified her thoughts and purified her intentions. She wrote of her children with love that transcended the circumstances of her writing. She expressed hope that they would remember her kindly despite the propaganda that had made her name synonymous with evil. She asked them to forgive those who had condemned her, understanding that revolutionary passions had made calm judgment impossible. She wanted them to know that she died at peace, sustained by faith that gave meaning to suffering that otherwise would have seemed pointless and cruel. The night before her execution, she slept more soundly than she had in months, her mind finally quiet after years of anxiety and fear. She dreamed of gardens where flowers grew in patterns that pleased the eye without requiring rigid geometry to prove human control over nature. She dreamed of her children laughing, their voices bright with joy that had not yet been touched by knowledge of loss and betrayal. She dreamed of her mother, young and strong, smiling with approval that erased decades of complicated feelings between them. She woke in darkness before dawn, rising from her straw mattress for the last time with movements that had become automatic through repetition. The simple white dress she would wear to her execution lay ready, its plainness a final rejection of the elaborate costumes that had once defined her public image. She dressed herself without assistance, her fingers steady as she fastened the simple closures, her mind focused on maintaining the dignity that had sustained her through the trial. The priest arrived to hear her final confession and offer spiritual comfort. She knelt on the cold stone floor of her cell, speaking words that released her from burdens she had carried for years. The act of confession provided relief that had nothing to do with whether revolutionary authorities recognized the validity of religious ritual. She was speaking to God now, not to human judges whose verdict had already been delivered. In this conversation with the divine, she found absolution that political systems could not grant or withhold. The guards who came to escort her to the scaffold showed faces marked by emotions they struggled to control. Whatever they had expected to feel when confronting the infamous Austrian queen, the reality of taking a composed, aging woman to her death created moral discomfort that revolutionary ideology had not prepared them to handle. She spoke to them gently, thanking them for small courtesies they had shown during her imprisonment, releasing them from any guilt they might feel about their role in her destruction. Supper walked through prison corridors toward the waiting cart, proceeded with ceremonial slowness, each step measured and deliberate. She kept her head high, her back straight, her movements graceful despite exhaustion and fear. This final performance for unknown observers mattered to her in ways that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with maintaining human dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. The cart that would carry her to the scaffold was deliberately crude, the same type used for common criminals. She climbed into it without assistance, settling herself on the rough wooden seat with as much composure as if it were a gilded carriage. The horses began moving, their hooves loud on the cobblestones, pulling her through streets she had not seen in years of captivity. The crowds that lined the route were enormous, thousands of faces showing expressions that ranged from triumphant hatred to unexpected sympathy. She looked at them without flinching, meeting their eyes with steady gaze that neither challenged nor pleaded. These were her subjects, the people she had been sent to France to serve. That she had failed them was undeniable. That she would die at their hands was just if justice meant that someone must pay for accumulated suffering that had complex causes but demanded simple explanations. The Place de la Révolution, where the guillotine waited, opened before her like a vast stage prepared for the final act of a tragedy that had been building for decades. The Posthumous platform rose above the crowd, the blade gleaming in morning light that had just begun to brighten the eastern sky. She saw the instrument that would end her life with curiosity more than fear, studying its mechanism with interest that had nothing to do with dread and everything to do with accepting reality on its own terms. She stepped down from the cart with the same grace that had characterized her movements throughout her life, refusing assistance from guards who reached out to help her navigate the height. Her legs were steady as she climbed the steps to the platform, each rise bringing her closer to the conclusion she had been preparing for since the day her trial ended. The executioner waited at the top, his face hidden behind a hood that made him seem less human and more like an abstract force of historical necessity. The crowd below had fallen quiet, their voices stilling as they recognized they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered for generations. She stood on the platform looking out over thousands of upturned faces, seeing in them all the complexity of humanity, capable of both cruelty and compassion, driven by forces they only partly understood toward ends they could not fully anticipate. She felt no hatred toward them, only sorrow that her life had become the symbol through which they sought to resolve contradictions that her death would not actually eliminate. She stepped accidentally on the executioner's foot as she moved toward the block, and her last words were an apology that revealed her character more clearly than any elaborate final statement could have done. Even at the moment of her death, courtesy and consideration for others remained instinctive, requiring no thought or calculation. The executioner accepted her apology with a slight nod. Moved despite himself by this final gesture of ordinary human kindness, she knelt before the block with steady movements, positioning herself as instructed by the executioner. The wood felt hard against her neck, rough and scarred by previous use. She closed her eyes not from fear but to focus her attention on prayers that gave meaning to what was about to happen. Her breathing remained calm, her body still, her mind fixed on spiritual truths that transcended the physical reality of her immediate situation. The blade fell with a sound like thunder contained in a single instant. The crowd gasped, thousands of voices creating a wave of sound that broke over the platform and receded, leaving silence that felt deeper than any quiet that had come before. The woman who had been Marie Antoinette, Archduchess of Austria and Queen of France, ceased to exist in physical form, her body becoming merely the remains of someone who had lived 37 years marked by extraordinary privilege and extraordinary suffering. Her head was displayed to the crowd as revolutionary protocol required, this final humiliation designed to demonstrate that monarchy had been destroyed completely. But the face that was shown to thousands of witnesses bore an expression of such peace that it troubled even those who had most strongly supported her execution. She had somehow managed to die with dignity and tact, transforming her destruction into something that looked disturbingly like transcendence. The disposal of her body was handled with deliberate simplicity designed to prevent creation of sites that might become focuses for counter-revolutionary devotion. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the Madeleine Cemetery, along with other victims of revolutionary justice. No ceremony marked her interment, no prayers spoken over remains that revolutionary ideology insisted were merely organic matter, no different from any other corpse. The authorities wanted her forgotten, erased from history as completely as she had been eliminated from physical existence, but memory proved impossible to control through official decree or ideological insistence. The story of her life and death began circulating immediately, carried by witnesses who had seen her final moments, by guards who had observed her behavior during imprisonment, by courtiers who had known her at Versailles. These accounts varied wildly in their details and interpretations, some portraying her as a martyr of almost supernatural virtue, others maintaining she had been justly punished for crimes against the nation. The news of her execution spread across Europe through diplomatic channels and newspaper reports, each national audience interpreting its significance through their own political and cultural frameworks. In Vienna, the court that had raised her received the information with grief tempered by relief that her suffering had ended. They commissioned memorial services that transformed her from a political liability into a symbol of Habsburg dignity under persecution. In London, parliamentarians debated the proper response to her death with arguments that revealed deep divisions within British society about revolutionary ideology and monarchical institutions. Some speakers condemned her execution as murder that proved revolutionary France had descended into barbarism. Others argued more cautiously that while her death was regrettable, it reflected understandable rage against systematic oppression that British reforms had prevented from building to similar levels in their own country. The immigrant communities scattered across Europe responded to her execution with shock that strengthened their resolve to oppose revolutionary France. For aristocrats who had fled seeking safety while hoping eventual reconciliation might allow their return, her death eliminated any possibility of compromise with a regime that had proven itself willing to destroy even queens who represented valuable diplomatic assets. Religious leaders throughout Europe found in her execution powerful confirmation that revolutionary ideology represented fundamental threat to Christian civilization. Her final letter's expression of forgiveness became a sacred text that churches used to demonstrate spiritual superiority of traditional faith over revolutionary materialism. Memorial services, held across the continent, portrayed her as a Christian martyr whose death revealed the essentially anti-religious nature of radical politics. Artists responded to her execution by creating works that explored themes of innocence destroyed by political fanaticism. Paintings depicted her final moments with religious imagery that emphasized her transformation from worldly queen to spiritual martyr. Sculptures showed her in poses suggesting serenity and acceptance that contrasted sharply with violent circumstances of her actual death. These artistic interpretations shaped popular memory more powerfully than historical facts, creating iconic images that would influence how future generations understood her significance. Writers composed poems and plays and eventually novels that used her story as foundation for examining broader questions about justice. The most sophisticated of these literary responses recognized that her tragedy reflected not just personal misfortune, but collision between traditional social structures and revolutionary ideologies that neither side fully understood or could adequately control. The emergence of Napoleon Bonaparte and his gradual transformation of revolutionary France into an empire created new political context that allowed more nuanced assessment of her legacy. Napoleon's restoration of court ceremony and aristocratic titles seemed to vindicate arguments that revolutionary extremism had destroyed valuable traditions along with harmful abuses. His marriage to Marie Louise of Austria created symbolic parallel with Marie Antoinette's earlier union that suggested possibility of reconciling revolutionary achievements with monarchical stability. Yet Napoleon maintained strategic silence about Marie Antoinette's fate, understanding that any appearance of sympathy for the executed queen might undermine his authority with former revolutionaries who formed crucial components of his political coalition. This calculated avoidance of her memory spoke volumes about continuing power of revolutionary mythology to shape French political discourse even after the revolution itself had been superseded by imperial government. The Bourbon Restoration that followed Napoleon's defeat provided first official opportunities for publicly honoring Marie Antoinette's memory. Louis XVIII commissioned elaborate memorial ceremonies designed to demonstrate that France had learned to distinguish between legitimate criticism of royal policies and destructive extremism that had led to regicide. These commemorations were carefully crafted to promote national reconciliation rather than counter-revolutionary vengeance. The chapel built at the site of her grave became a pilgrimage destination that attracted visitors from throughout Europe who sought to pay respects to someone they viewed as victim of political fanaticism. The simple monument erected in her honor deliberately contrasted with elaborate tombs characterizing traditional royal burials, emphasizing her transformation from worldly queen to spiritual symbol transcending ordinary political categories. The flowers and prayers left by anonymous visitors demonstrated that her story continued to resonate with ordinary people who found in her fate reflection of their own struggles with forces beyond personal control. Women particularly seemed drawn to her memory, seeing in her experiences echoes of their own vulnerability to social systems that reduced them to symbols serving purposes. The decades following the Bourbon Restoration witnessed a gradual evolution in how French society understood Marie Antoinette's place in their national story. The simple white monument marking her burial site became more than a memorial to one woman. It transformed into a meeting point where different French political traditions could acknowledge shared history while maintaining their distinct interpretations of what her life and death meant for France's future. Visitors who came to the chapel in the years after its construction left written accounts that reveal fascinating complexity in how her memory was being processed by people from vastly different backgrounds and political persuasions. Former revolutionaries who had supported radical transformation of French society found themselves unexpectedly moved by evidence of her personal suffering. They wrote in visitor books about experiencing uncomfortable recognition that the symbolic enemy they had condemned bore little resemblance to the actual woman who had faced death with such remarkable composure. Conservative monarchists who visited the chapel discovered in these same testimonies evidence that French society was capable of moral growth that allowed acknowledgement of past wrongs without demanding complete renunciation of revolutionary principle. The visitor books became informal dialogues between people who disagreed profoundly about politics but could find common ground in recognizing the human tragedy of Marie Antoinette's fate. These written exchanges suggested possibilities for national reconciliation that formal political structures had not yet achieved. The development of historical scholarship during the mid-19th century brought new methodologies to the study of her life that attempted to distinguish between documented facts and legendary accretions. Professional historians began systematically examining court records, diplomatic correspondence, and financial documents that had survived revolutionary destruction. Their work revealed a woman far more complex than either the demonic figure of revolutionary propaganda or the saintly martyr of counter-revolutionary literature had suggested. These scholarly investigations demonstrated that many specific accusations against her had been based on fabrications or gross distortions of actual events. The phrase about eating cake was proven conclusively to be a complete invention that had circulated in European satirical literature. Similar research revealed that her actual spending, while substantial by ordinary standards, represented a small fraction of total royal expenditures and had been largely devoted to ceremonial obligations rather than purely personal indulgence. Yet these factual corrections had limited impact on popular understanding of her historical significance, because her symbolic meaning had become detached from specific biographical details. She represented something larger than herself in the collective imagination, serving as a focal point for ongoing debates about privilege and suffering, foreign influence and national identity, feminine power and patriarchal control. The actual woman who had lived and died mattered less than what people needed her to represent in their own struggles to make sense of revolutionary change and its consequences. The emergence of photography as a widely accessible medium during the latter half of the 19th century created new possibilities for engaging with spaces that had shaped her life. Early photographs of Versailles captured the palace in a state of partial abandonment, its gardens overgrown, its fountains silent, its windows dark. These haunting images conveyed something that written descriptions could not about the complete disappearance of the world Marie Antoinette had inhabited. The magnificent rooms that had once hosted thousands of courtiers stood empty, their mirrors reflecting nothing but dust motes drifting through shafts of sunlight. Mae Dublin and Macubsadwills was esquan zaid of the most of badi saswalked in Syria compsen into the secum apurged. The stone walls, the small window, the rough furniture, all appeared in photographs that allowed people who would never visit. These images created emotional connections that transformed abstract historical knowledge into visceral understanding of what she had endured. The development of mass tourism during the same period brought unprecedented numbers of visitors to sites associated with her story. The Palace of Versailles, which had been converted into a museum celebrating French history, attracted visitors from across Europe. These tourists walked through rooms where she had danced and dined and held court, their guidebooks providing narratives that emphasized different aspects of her story depending on the political orientation of the authors. Liberal guidebooks tended to present her as a tragic figure whose personal qualities had been insufficient to save a political system that had become incompatible with modern ideas about government and citizenship. These accounts acknowledged her suffering while maintaining that revolutionary change had been necessary and ultimately beneficial, despite the human costs it had demanded. The emphasis was on learning from past mistakes while moving forward into a future that combined democracy with respect for individual dignity. Conservative guidebooks, by contrast, portrayed her as a victim of mob violence that proved the dangers of democratic excess unchecked by traditional restraints. These narratives emphasized her virtues while depicting revolution as fundamentally destructive force that had swept away valuable traditions along with genuine abuses. The lesson they drew from her story was about the importance of maintaining established institutions and resisting radical change that promised utopia, but delivered chaos and cruelty. The construction of railways that connected Versailles to Paris and to other major French cities made these sites accessible to middle-class visitors whose parents or grandparents would never have been able to afford such journeys. This democratization of access to historical sites created new audiences for Marie Antoinette's story that crossed class boundaries in ways that would have been unimaginable during her lifetime. Factory workers and shopkeepers walked the same corridors that had once been reserved for aristocrats, their presence a tangible demonstration of how completely French society had been transformed. These middle-class tourists often responded to Versailles with complicated emotions that mixed admiration for its beauty with disapproval of the excess it represented. They appreciated the artistic achievement embodied in the palace's architecture and decoration, while simultaneously condemning the systematic inequality. Marie Antoinette became for them a symbol of this contradiction, someone whose life had been shaped by circumstances she had not chosen and could not escape, making her both privileged and trapped in ways that were difficult to disentangle. The international expositions that became popular during the late 19th century frequently included exhibits devoted to Marie Antoinette's life and times. These displays combined historical artifacts with theatrical reconstructions that brought her world to life for audiences who knew it only through books and lectures. Mannequins wearing reproductions of her famous dresses stood in recreated palace interiors, while explanatory texts provided biographical information that emphasized different aspects of her story depending on the nationality and political orientation of the exhibition organizers. French expositions tended to present her within narratives of national progress that acknowledged revolutionary violence as regrettable but necessary stage in France's evolution toward modern democracy. These exhibits often included artifacts from both her life of luxury and her imprisonment, creating visual contrasts that illustrated the complete reversal of her circumstances. The message was complex, suggesting that her fate had been simultaneously tragic and historically inevitable, deserving of sympathy while also serving as warning about the unsustainability of absolute monarchy. Austrian expositions emphasized her Habsburg origins and presented her as a victim of French political instability that had destroyed an innocent representative of a superior culture. These exhibits highlighted her childhood in Vienna, her education in refined arts, and her attempts to bring Austrian sophistication to a French court they portrayed as decadent and morally corrupt. The revolutionary violence that ended her life was depicted as barbarism that revealed fundamental differences between civilized Austrian culture. American exhibitions showed particular fascination with the romantic and dramatic elements of her biography, often downplaying complex political context in favor of personal relationships and emotional experiences. These displays emphasized her youth and beauty, her apparent love of pleasure, and her tragic end in ways that appealed to audiences who viewed European history as exotic entertainment rather than as political lessons relevant to their own democratic society. The tendency was to transform her into a universal symbol of feminine vulnerability rather than a specific historical figure. The emergence of women's movements during the late 19th and early 20th centuries created entirely new frameworks for interpreting her story. Early feminist thinkers recognized that criticism of Marie Antoinette had focused obsessively on aspects of her behavior that were typically used to police women's conduct: her appearance, her friendships, her spending on clothes and jewelry, her influence over her husband. These patterns of gendered attack suggested that her destruction had reflected not just revolutionary hostility toward monarchy but deeper cultural anxieties about female power and autonomy. Feminist scholars began analyzing the revolutionary pamphlets and propaganda materials that had systematically destroyed her reputation before her physical execution. They documented how sexual innuendo and accusations of feminine excess had been deployed as political weapons designed to undermine her authority and justify her elimination. The fact that male rulers who spent far more lavishly and behaved far more irresponsibly rarely faced similar personal attacks revealed the extent to which gender had shaped her persecution. These feminist reinterpretations argued that Marie Antoinette's fate illustrated broader patterns of misogyny that continued to constrain women's participation in public life. Her experience demonstrated that women who exercised or appeared to exercise political influence would face forms of personal attack that male leaders could largely avoid. The systematic sexualization of criticism directed at her, the obsessive focus on her body and her relationships, the reduction of complex political questions to accusations about her feminine weakness. All these patterns persisted in how democratic societies treated women who sought political power. The recognition that her destruction had gendered dimensions did not require romanticizing her character or excusing her genuine failings. Feminist scholars acknowledged that she had been privileged in ways that most women could never imagine, that her suffering, while real, had occurred within context of luxury that ordinary people could not comprehend. But they argued that her privilege had not protected her from forms of attack that were specifically designed to exploit her vulnerability as a woman operating in systems that fundamentally distrusted female authority. The development of cinema during the early 20th century created unprecedented opportunities for bringing her story to mass audiences. Silent films depicting her life began appearing as early as the 1910s, their visual narratives emphasizing dramatic elements that could be conveyed without dialogue. These early cinematic interpretations tended to focus on spectacle, recreating the magnificence of Versailles and the horror of revolutionary violence in ways that appealed to audiences seeking entertainment rather than historical education. The actors who portrayed Marie Antoinette in these early films brought their own interpretations to the role, some emphasizing her frivolity and apparent thoughtlessness, others highlighting her grace under pressure and her maternal devotion. The lack of recorded sound meant that these performances relied entirely on physical expression, creating portrayals that sometimes bore little resemblance to documented accounts of her actual demeanor and behavior. Yet these cinematic images proved enormously influential in shaping popular understanding of her character and significance. The advent of sound films in the late 1920s and 30s brought new dimensions to cinematic portrayals of her life. Actresses could now speak the words attributed to her, their vocal performances adding layers of meaning that silent films could only suggest through title cards and physical expression. The most successful of these sound-era films recognized that her story provided perfect material for exploring universal themes about youth confronting circumstances beyond its control, beauty facing destruction, and grace persisting despite suffering. Hollywood productions in particular showed fascination with her story that reflected American audiences' complex relationship with European aristocracy. These films often portrayed her sympathetically as someone whose personal qualities were admirable even if the system she represented was fundamentally unjust. The tendency was to separate her individual character from the broader political and social structures that had shaped her life, allowing audiences to sympathize with her suffering without questioning their own democratic values or confronting uncomfortable truths about revolutionary violence. The Second World War and its aftermath created new contexts for understanding her fate. People who had witnessed totalitarian regimes systematically persecuting entire classes of citizens recognized disturbing parallels between 18th century revolutionary justice and 20th century ideological violence. Her execution began to be understood not just as a specific historical event but as an early example of patterns that would characterize modern political extremism, the reduction of complex individuals to symbolic enemies, the use of show trials to provide legal veneer for predetermined outcomes, the systematic dehumanization that made mass violence psychologically possible. These comparisons between revolutionary terror and totalitarian persecution did not require equating different historical circumstances or suggesting that all forms of political violence were equivalent. But they did reveal common patterns in how ideological movements transformed individuals into symbols that could be destroyed without moral compunction. Marie Antoinette's fate demonstrated that once someone had been successfully portrayed as representing everything a political movement opposed, their actual character and conduct became irrelevant to their destruction. The post-war period also witnessed growing interest in psychological dimensions of her story. Scholars began exploring how someone raised in the artificial environment of absolute monarchy could develop emotional resources necessary to face persecution and death with dignity. These psychological analyses suggested that the very superficiality that had characterized her early years as queen, her focus on fashion and entertainment and social pleasure, might have served as coping mechanism that protected her from recognizing the impossible contradictions of her position. The psychological interpretations argued that her apparent frivolity had allowed her to maintain emotional equilibrium in a world where genuine self-expression was impossible and authentic relationships were rare. The elaborate ceremonies and constant social performance that had defined life at Versailles would have been psychologically unbearable for someone who took them entirely seriously. Her ability to find pleasure in surface beauty and social interaction, far from being evidence of moral failing, might have represented adaptive strategy that preserved her sanity within fundamentally dehumanizing circumstances. Only when those external structures collapsed during her imprisonment had she been forced to develop different psychological resources. The quiet hours alone in her cell, stripped of all external validation and social performance, had required her to discover internal sources of strength and meaning. The transformation that observers noted during her trial and execution reflected genuine psychological growth that suffering had produced. She had learned to define herself through internal rather than external criteria, to find dignity in how she faced circumstances rather than in circumstances themselves. The 1960s and 70s brought renewed scholarly interest in her story as historians developed new methods for analyzing cultural and social dimensions of political power. These approaches emphasized the importance of ritual, ceremony, and symbolic representation in maintaining governmental authority. Marie Antoinette's fate was examined through these frameworks, revealing how her destruction had reflected not just ideological conflicts but fundamental changes in how European societies understood the relationship between rulers and subjects. Cultural historians argued that the ceremonial magnificence that had once demonstrated legitimate authority had become by the late 18th century evidence of illegitimate privilege that alienated rather than inspired popular loyalty. The very displays that were supposed to reinforce royal power had come to seem like mockery of people struggling with poverty and injustice. Marie Antoinette's spending on clothes and jewelry and entertainment, which would have been unremarkable for queens in earlier eras, had occurred at precisely the historical moment when such expenditures began to be interpreted through frameworks of economic inequality and social injustice. This cultural analysis suggested that her destruction had been overdetermined by forces that transcended her individual choices or character. No matter how virtuously she had behaved, no matter how carefully she had managed her household expenses, she would likely have faced similar persecution because she represented a system that had lost its legitimacy in the eyes of significant portions of French society. Her foreign origins made her particularly vulnerable, but the fundamental crisis was about monarchy itself rather than about any specific monarch or queen. The feminist movements of the 70s and 80s brought new urgency to analysis of the gendered dimensions of her persecution. Second-wave feminists recognized that the patterns of attack she had faced, the sexualization of political criticism, the focus on appearance and personal relationships, the accusations of using feminine wiles to manipulate male authority, all these remained depressingly familiar in how contemporary democratic societies treated women seeking political power. Her story served as historical precedent for understanding how misogyny operated even in supposedly progressive political movements. These feminist scholars documented how revolutionary ideologies that proclaimed universal equality had simultaneously reinforced traditional gender hierarchies by eliminating spaces where aristocratic women had exercised informal political influence. The destruction of court society had not liberated women, but had instead confined them more strictly to domestic spheres while reserving formal political authority. Marie Antoinette's execution had sent a clear message about the fate awaiting women who attempted to influence public affairs, establishing precedents that would constrain women's political participation for generations. The preservation and restoration of Versailles during the late 20th century created opportunities for contemporary visitors to experience something of the physical environment. The careful recreation of period furnishings and decorations allowed modern people to glimpse the material culture that had defined aristocratic existence. Walking through the Hall of Mirrors or visiting the Petit Trianon, visitors could begin to understand both the beauty and the oppressiveness of a world where every moment was governed by elaborate protocols. These restored spaces served as powerful reminders of how completely that world had been destroyed. The magnificent rooms that had once been constantly filled with courtiers now stood mostly empty, their silence emphasizing the absence of the society that had given them purpose. The gardens that had required armies of workers to maintain were now maintained by small professional staffs. Everything about the preserved palace spoke of discontinuity, of a way of life so thoroughly eliminated that it could only be understood through imaginative reconstruction. Educational programs developed around the palace sites during this period showed particular interest in making Marie Antoinette's story accessible to young people who could benefit from engaging with questions about power, privilege, and responsibility that her life raised. Teachers found that students responded powerfully to the human dimensions of her biography, while learning important lessons about the dangers of political extremism, the importance of understanding different perspectives, and the complex relationships between individual choices and social circumstances. The digital revolution of the late 20th and early 21st centuries transformed access to historical materials related to her life. Manuscripts that had been available only to scholars who could travel to specific archives became accessible to anyone with internet connection. Letters she had written, account books from her household, diplomatic correspondence about her marriage, all of this documentary evidence became available for examination by people who previously would have had no way to engage with primary sources. Online communities dedicated to studying her biography emerged, bringing together people from around the world who shared fascination with her story. These digital spaces allowed collaborative research that crossed traditional boundaries between professional historians and interested amateurs. Participants shared discoveries about specific aspects of her life, debated interpretations of evidence, and created resources that made her story more accessible to broader audiences. The preservation of Versailles benefited enormously from digital technologies that allowed virtual tours and detailed documentation of spaces and objects associated with her life. High-resolution photographs captured textures and details that casual visitors might miss, while three-dimensional scanning created models that could be examined from any angle. These digital resources democratized access to historical materials while also creating permanent records that would survive if physical artifacts were damaged or destroyed. Social media platforms created new forms of engagement with her memory that emphasized emotional and personal connections rather than formal historical analysis. Users shared favorite portraits, discussed her fashion choices, debated aspects of her character and conduct in ways that mixed scholarly knowledge with personal interpretation. These informal digital conversations often revealed insights that academic scholarship had overlooked, particularly regarding how her story resonated with contemporary experiences of judgment and the struggle to maintain dignity under scrutiny. The bicentennial commemorations of her execution in 1993 provided occasions for reassessing her historical significance within contexts of ongoing debates about human rights, political violence, and historical memory. Official ceremonies in France attempted to balance acknowledgement of her suffering with recognition that revolutionary change had been necessary despite its human costs. These events revealed continuing divisions within French society about how to remember revolutionary period and its violence. Conservative participants in these commemorations emphasized her martyrdom and the injustice of her execution, arguing that her death represented triumph of mob violence over legal procedure and human dignity. Liberal participants acknowledged her suffering while maintaining that broader revolutionary achievements in establishing democratic principles justified the painful transitions that had been required. These different emphases reflected ongoing disagreements about the proper balance between honoring victims and celebrating political transformations that had produced modern democratic society. International responses to the bicentennial varied according to national political cultures and relationships with revolutionary traditions. Austrian commemorations emphasized her Habsburg origins and portrayed her as victim of French political instability. British observers used the occasion to reflect on how their own gradual political reforms had avoided the extreme violence that had characterized French revolutionary change. American commentators tended to focus on her personal story rather than broader political implications, consistent with cultural preferences for individual narratives over structural analysis. The emergence of third-wave feminism during the 1990s brought new sophistication to analysis of how gender had shaped her persecution. These scholars recognized that earlier feminist interpretations, while valuable, had sometimes oversimplified the intersections between her privilege. The new analyses attempted to hold in tension the reality that she had benefited from systematic inequalities, while also suffering from specifically gendered forms of attack that reflected cultural anxieties about female power. These more nuanced feminist approaches acknowledge that sympathy for her suffering did not require ignoring her privilege or romanticizing aristocratic society. She could simultaneously be understood as someone who had lived in extraordinary luxury and as someone who had been systematically dehumanized through propaganda that reduced her to a sexualized symbol of everything revolutionary ideology opposed. The complexity of her historical position made her valuable for exploring how different forms of power and vulnerability operated simultaneously within single individuals. The early 21st century witnessed continued fascination with her story as contemporary audiences struggled to understand relationships between celebrity culture, political power, and social media in democratic societies. Her experience of being simultaneously celebrated and vilified by public opinion seemed remarkably relevant to modern debates about the role of personality and image in political leadership. The speed with which her reputation had been destroyed through coordinated propaganda campaigns offered disturbing precedents for understanding how contemporary information technologies could be used to manipulate public opinion. The development of new biographical studies during this period benefited from methodological advances that allowed more sophisticated analysis of psychological, cultural, and social dimensions of her experience. Historians examined how childhood in the highly structured environment of Viennese court had shaped her expectations about authority and relationships. They analyzed how the transition to Versailles had required her to abandon familiar frameworks while developing new skills for navigating a court culture that operated according to different assumptions and values. These biographical studies paid particular attention to her relationships with her children, recognizing that her maternal role had provided her with purposes and identities independent of her political position. The birth of each child had transformed her understanding of herself and her responsibilities, creating bonds that persisted through political upheaval and physical separation. The forced separation from her children during her imprisonment represented destruction not just of political power, The final years of her life emerged in these new biographies as a period of remarkable personal growth that suffering had produced. The woman who had seemed frivolous during her early years at Versailles had discovered through persecution depths of character that had remained latent during times of privilege and comfort. Her composure during her trial, her forgiveness of enemies in her final letter, her dignity on the scaffold, all revealed genuine spiritual achievement that transcended the specific religious or political frameworks through which it might be interpreted. Modern scholars examining her execution within contexts of contemporary debates about capital punishment found in her story powerful arguments about the problems with state-sanctioned killing. The fact that her death had been carried out through elaborate legal procedures did not make it less problematic as an exercise of governmental power over individual life. Her destruction demonstrated that legal formalities could be used to provide veneer of legitimacy to killings that served political rather than genuine judicial purposes. The preservation of her memory through multiple overlapping forms, memorials and museums, books and films, academic scholarship and popular culture, created rich tapestry of interpretation that resisted simple summary. She meant different things to different people, serving as symbol for causes and perspectives that sometimes contradicted each other. This multiplicity of meaning reflected both the complexity of her actual historical position and the continuing relevance of questions her life and death raised about power, privilege, justice, and human dignity. The restoration of the conciergerie during the early 21st century involved careful preservation of her cell, along with creation of exhibits that contextualized her imprisonment within broader history of political detention and revolutionary justice. Visitors could see the actual space where she had spent her final weeks, its small size and harsh conditions creating visceral understanding that written descriptions could not convey. The experience of standing in that cell, imagining her spending months within its stone walls, produced emotional responses. The chapel where she had been reburied continued to attract visitors who came from around the world to pay respects or simply to contemplate the extraordinary arc of her life. The simple monument marking her grave stood in deliberate contrast to the elaborate tombs of her ancestors, its modesty suggesting that her significance lay not in worldly power, but in how she had faced its loss. Fresh flowers appeared regularly, left by anonymous visitors, whose motivations ranged from religious devotion to historical interest to simple human sympathy for suffering that transcended political allegiances. The ongoing scholarly debates about her historical significance continued to produce new insights and interpretations as each generation discovered aspects of her story that resonated with their own concerns and questions. Historians continued to uncover documentary evidence that illuminated previously unknown details of her daily life, her relationships, her thoughts and feelings as reflected in letters and other personal writings. These discoveries ensured that she remained not just a fixed historical symbol, but a subject of active investigation that contributed to evolving understanding of 18th century European political and cultural history. The international character of interest in her story reflected the global impact of revolutionary ideologies and democratic principles that had emerged from 18th century political upheavals. Her fate resonated with people throughout the world, who were grappling with questions about how to balance competing claims of tradition and innovation, individual rights and collective welfare, peaceful reform and revolutionary transformation. They served as a reminder that these questions involved real human beings whose lives and deaths carried meanings that extended beyond abstract political theories. The educational resources developed around her story for use in schools emphasized critical thinking about historical evidence and interpretation. Students learned to distinguish between primary sources and secondary accounts, to recognize how different perspectives shaped historical narratives, to understand that past events could be interpreted in multiple ways that reflected both evidence and the values of interpreters. Her story provided excellent material for these pedagogical purposes because the wealth of surviving documentation allowed examination of how the same events could be understood very differently depending on which sources were emphasized, and how they affected led examination of how the same events could be understood very differently depending on which sources were emphasized, were contextualized. The museum exhibitions devoted to her life evolved to incorporate new technologies that allowed more interactive and immersive experiences. Virtual reality applications let visitors experience recreations of Versailles during her residence there, walking through rooms as they would have appeared during her lifetime, hearing period music, even seeing digital representations of courtiers moving through their daily routines. These technological enhancements made her world more accessible while also raising questions about the difference between historical accuracy. The fashion industry's continuing fascination with her style demonstrated how thoroughly her image had penetrated popular culture. Designers regularly referenced her iconic looks in collections that reinterpreted 18th century aesthetics for contemporary audiences. These fashion tributes often ignored the complex historical circumstances that had shaped her actual clothing choices, instead treating her as a timeless style icon whose visual impact transcended political context. This commercialization of her image revealed both the persistence of her cultural presence and the ways that historical figures could be stripped of complexity to serve contemporary commercial purposes. The biographical films produced during the early 21st century showed greater attention to historical accuracy than earlier cinematic treatments had typically demonstrated. Filmmakers consulted with historians to ensure that settings, costumes, and dialogue reflected documented evidence about her life and times. Yet even these more historically informed productions necessarily made choices about which aspects of her story to emphasize, which relationships to highlight, which interpretations of ambiguous evidence to adopt. The results were films that educated while also shaping popular understanding in ways that privileged entertainment values alongside historical fidelity. The literary treatments of her story ranged from rigorously researched historical novels to more fantastical reimaginings that used her life as starting point for creative exploration. The best of these literary works recognized that historical fiction could illuminate emotional and psychological truths that academic history sometimes struggled to convey. By imagining her inner life, her thoughts and feelings and private moments, novelists created portraits that felt true to human experience even when specific details could not be verified through documentary evidence. The anniversary commemorations that occurred at regular intervals, marking significant dates in her life and death, provided occasions for reassessing her legacy in light of contemporary concerns. Each commemoration revealed how new generations discovered fresh relevance in her story, finding connections to their own experiences of social change, political conflict, and the struggle to maintain personal integrity within systems that seemed designed to destroy individual dignity. These recurring moments of collective memory ensured that she remained present in historical consciousness rather than fading into obscurity. The academic conferences devoted to studying her life brought together scholars from multiple disciplines who approached her story through different methodological frameworks. Historians provided documentary evidence about her actions and circumstances. Literary scholars analyzed representations of her in novels and poems and plays. Art historians examined portraits and other visual depictions. Political scientists explored how her fate illuminated broader patterns in revolutionary change. These interdisciplinary conversations generated insights that no single discipline could have produced independently. The online archives that made documents related to her life freely available to researchers worldwide democratized historical scholarship in ways that would have been impossible in earlier eras. Graduate students in distant countries could examine the same primary sources that had once been accessible only to scholars with resources to travel to European archives. So this currentization of access produced more diverse interpretations as people from different cultural backgrounds brought new perspectives to familiar materials. The preservation efforts that continued at Versailles and other sites associated with her life required constant work to protect. Textiles that she had worn or touched required climate-controlled storage and careful handling. Furniture from her apartments needed regular conservation to prevent wood from cracking or gilding from flaking. Letters in her handwriting were preserved in acid-free folders that protected delicate paper from further degradation. These ongoing preservation efforts represented commitment to maintaining physical connections to her life that would otherwise be lost to time. The scholarly editions of her correspondence that were published during this period provided invaluable resources for understanding her thoughts and perspectives in her own words. The editors of these collections annotated her letters with contextual information that explained references and circumstances. These editions revealed someone more thoughtful and observant than revolutionary propaganda had suggested, capable of acute psychological insight about the people around her and realistic assessment of her own difficult position. The musical compositions inspired by her story ranged from formal operas to popular songs that referenced her iconic status. Composers found in her biography rich material for exploring themes of beauty and mortality, power and vulnerability, innocence and experience. The operas in particular used her story to examine timeless questions about fate and free will, about whether individuals could escape destinies that seemed predetermined by circumstances of birth and historical moment. The philosophical treatments of her story explored her relevance for understanding questions about moral responsibility under conditions of systemic injustice. Philosophers asked whether she could be held personally accountable for suffering caused by systems she had not created and could not control. They examined whether her privilege made her complicit in oppression even if she had not consciously chosen to benefit from inequality. These philosophical inquiries used her specific case to illuminate broader questions about individual agency within social structures that constrained choice in ways that were often invisible to those operating within them. The psychological studies of revolutionary crowd behavior used accounts of her execution to understand how ordinary people could participate in violence that individually they might have found abhorrent. The transformation of complex human beings into symbolic enemies that could be destroyed without moral compunction represented a psychological process that had been repeated throughout history in different contexts. Understanding how this transformation had occurred with Marie Antoinette provided insights into preventing similar dehumanization in contemporary political conflicts. The commemorative stamps and coins issued by various nations on anniversaries of her birth or death demonstrated how thoroughly she had entered global historical consciousness. These small official acknowledgments of her significance reached audiences who might never read books about her or visit museums devoted to her memory. The images chosen for these commemorative items revealed what aspects of her story different societies emphasized, some showing her in royal splendor, others depicting her with her children, still others representing her final moments. The gardens at Versailles that she had loved required constant maintenance to preserve their historical character while accommodating millions of visitors who came each year. The challenge was to balance preservation of authentic historical landscapes with practical necessities of managing contemporary tourism. Sincere, the Petit Trianon in particular, represented her personal aesthetic preferences, her desire for more natural settings that contrasted with the geometric precision of formal French gardens. Maintaining these spaces honored her memory while also providing visitors with beautiful environments for contemplation and reflection. The documentary films produced about her life combined historical footage of preservation sites with expert interviews and dramatic reenactments that brought her story to television audiences. These documentaries varied widely in quality and historical accuracy, some providing sophisticated analysis of her complex position, others reducing her to simple victim or villain depending on the political orientation of the producers. The best of these films acknowledged ambiguities and contradictions in the historical record, resisting temptation to provide simple answers to complicated questions about her character and significance. As the evening grows quieter and darkness settles more completely around us, we can see how Marie Antoinette's story continues to unfold across generations. The young archduchess who left Vienna could never have imagined the countless ways her name would be remembered, debated, honored, and condemned across more than 2 centuries. Her remarkable journey from Austrian palace to French throne to revolutionary scaffold demonstrates truths about human experience that transcend specific historical circumstances. The stone walls of Versailles still stand, their mirrors reflecting only emptiness where once reflected the light of thousands of candles and the movements of courtiers, whose world seems impossibly distant now. The cell in the conciergerie remains preserved, its cold stone a memorial to suffering that words can describe but never fully convey. These physical spaces anchor memory, providing tangible connections to a life that otherwise might seem too extraordinary to have been real. Tonight, as you drift toward peaceful rest, carry with you the knowledge that her story, like all human stories, speaks to universal experiences of hope and fear, love and loss, dignity maintained despite circumstances that seem designed to destroy it. May her memory settle gently into your consciousness, not as burden of historical tragedy, but as reminder that grace remains possible even in darkest moments, that forgiveness can transcend hatred, that the human spirit possesses resources that suffering reveals rather than destroys. Sleep peacefully, knowing that tomorrow will bring new opportunities to engage with history's lessons. to honor those who came before, to learn from their triumphs and their tragedies, how to live with greater wisdom and compassion in our own complicated times. The morning light that filters through the windows of Versailles today falls on rooms that Marie Antoinette would recognize in their physical dimensions, but not in their silence. The absence of human voices creates an emptiness that speaks more powerfully than any description could about the complete disappearance of the society that once filled these spaces with constant activity. When she walked these corridors, the rustle of silk accompanied every step. The murmur of conversation rose and fell like waves. The click of heeled shoes on marble floors created rhythms that marked the passage of hours devoted entirely to ceremony and display. The visitors who come now move through these rooms with reverence usually reserved for sacred spaces. They speak in whispers, though no signs demand silence. Something about the preserved grandeur inspires a hush that feels appropriate to the weight of history these walls contain. They pause before portraits of her, examining the face that had been celebrated for its beauty and later vilified as the embodiment of aristocratic excess. The paintings show someone young and confident, dressed in silks and jewels that caught the light and reflected it back in patterns that demonstrated the painter's skill as much as the subject's magnificence. The oldest of these portraits, created when she first arrived in France, reveal a girl who had not yet learned to guard her expressions. The smile appears genuine rather than calculated, the eyes bright with excitement rather than wary from years of hostile scrutiny. Art historians who study these images note how her face changed over the years of her reign, how the openness of youth gave way to something more carefully controlled, how the pleasure in being observed transformed into awareness that observation meant judgment, and that judgment was rarely kind. The later portraits, created after she had borne children and weathered scandals, show someone who had learned the costs of visibility. The smile remained but took on qualities that suggested performance rather than spontaneous emotion. The positioning of her body became more deliberately regal, shoulders held back, chin lifted to angles that photographers today would recognize as flattering but unnatural. These calculated poses revealed her growing understanding that every image would be scrutinized for evidence of character flaws or political intentions, making authentic self-presentation impossible. The miniature portraits that were created for private exchange among family members and close friends show aspects of her appearance that official images carefully concealed. In these small, intimate paintings, her face appears more relaxed, the expressions more varied and human. Some show her laughing, mouth open in ways that court painters would have considered undignified for formal portraiture. Others capture her in moments of quiet contemplation, eyes focused on something beyond the painter's view. The physical artifacts that survived the revolutionary destruction of royal property provide tangible connections to her daily existence that portraits alone cannot convey. The dresses preserved in museum collections demonstrate the extraordinary craftsmanship that went into creating her wardrobe. Each gown required hundreds of hours of skilled labor, seamstresses working by candlelight to create garments that would be worn perhaps once or twice before being set aside for something newer. The embroidery on some dresses shows such minute detail that examining it requires magnification to appreciate the fineness of the stitches. The shoes that survive from her wardrobe seem impossibly small and delicate, their heels high enough to alter posture and gait in ways that modern wearers would find challenging. The silk from which they were made has faded over centuries, but the basic construction remains sound, testament to the quality of materials and craftsmanship that characterized luxury goods of the period. Walking in such shoes would have required constant attention to balance and movement, making every step a performance that demonstrated grace and control. The jewelry that had adorned her person during her years as queen was largely dispersed during the revolutionary period, sold to finance military campaigns or simply stolen by people who found themselves with access to treasures that no longer had obvious owners. The pieces that survived and can be definitively traced to her ownership appear in museum collections around the world. Diamonds and pearls and precious metals worked into forms that demonstrated the jeweler's art while also broadcasting the wearer's status and wealth. The famous diamond earrings that appear in several portraits exemplify the kind of jewelry she favored during her early years at Versailles. Each earring contained multiple diamonds arranged in cascade that caught light with every movement of her head, creating small rainbows that drew attention to her face, while also demonstrating wealth beyond what ordinary people could comprehend. The weight of such earrings would have pulled constantly at her earlobes, creating discomfort that she learned to ignore as the price of magnificence. The simpler jewelry she wore during her imprisonment tells a different story about adaptation to changed circumstances. The few pieces she was allowed to keep were modest by her previous standards, small rings or simple chains that provided continuity with her former life without obviously flouting the revolutionary commitment to equality. These humble objects, preserved now in collections that recognize their historical significance, speak more powerfully than the elaborate court jewels about the complete reversal of her fortune. The letters she wrote throughout her life provide the most direct access to her thoughts and feelings, though interpreting them requires careful attention to context and awareness that all royal correspondence served multiple purposes beyond simple personal communication. The early letters to her mother in Vienna show someone eager to please, reporting dutifully on her progress in becoming French while also revealing homesickness and confusion about expectations she struggled to understand. As the years passed and her position at Versailles became more established, her letters took on different qualities. The constant need to reassure her mother about her successful adaptation to French court life gradually gave way to more confident assertions about her own judgment and preferences. She began expressing opinions about political matters, though always carefully framed to demonstrate proper deference to male authority. These political observations revealed someone more engaged with governance than revolutionary propaganda would later suggest. Someone who paid attention to consequences of policies and understood complexities of balancing competing interests. The letters to her brother Leopold after she became queen show her attempting to maintain connections with her Austrian family while also protecting French interests that were sometimes opposed to Austrian ambitions. This balancing act required considerable diplomatic skill, phrasing requests for assistance in ways that emphasized family loyalty rather than political calculation. The letters demonstrate her awareness that every word she wrote might be read by others beyond the intended recipient, making complete honesty impossible even in supposedly private correspondence. The final letters written from her prison cell achieve a clarity and directness that earlier correspondence often lacked. Freed from the need to maintain appearances or manage multiple audiences, she could write with honesty about her situation and her feelings. The letter to Madame Elizabeth composed on the morning of her execution stands as one of the most remarkable documents in the history of political persecutions, its expressions of forgiveness and acceptance revealing spiritual resources that suffering had uncovered rather than destroyed. The physical act of writing that final letter in the dim light of her cell, knowing that these words would be her last communication with the living, required courage of a different order than the physical bravery needed to face the guillotine. Each sentence represented a choice about how she wanted to be remembered, what legacy she hoped to leave for her children who might someday read these words and need to understand that their mother had died without bitterness or hatred. The care she took with this final composition shows in the relatively neat handwriting despite the physical and emotional strain she was experiencing. The preservation of this letter and others like it happened almost by accident. Documents saved by people who recognized their historical value, even when the regime that had created them was actively trying to erase all traces of the monarchy it had destroyed. Some letters survived because the recipients treasured them as personal mementos regardless of their political significance. Others were preserved by archivists who understood their duty to protect historical records even when doing so might be politically dangerous. The furniture from her apartments at Versailles that survived revolutionary destruction provides physical evidence of the environment in which she spent her daily life. The delicate chairs and tables, the ornate cabinets and writing desks, all demonstrate the same commitment to beauty and craftsmanship that characterized her clothing and jewelry. Each piece was designed not just for function but as an aesthetic object that would contribute to the overall visual harmony of the rooms it occupied. The writing desk from her private apartments at the Petit Trianon shows wear patterns that suggest frequent use. The surface bears small scratches and ink stains that accumulated over years of correspondence and personal writing. Sitting at this desk today, one can imagine her in the same position, pen in hand, searching for words that would convey her meaning while navigating the complex requirements of royal correspondence. The act of writing at this particular desk creates a sense of connection across centuries, a moment of shared human activity that transcends the vast differences in circumstances. The harp that she played for personal entertainment rather than public performance sits now in a museum collection, like its strings long silent but its decorative painted surface still showing the pastoral scenes that reflected her taste for romanticized depictions of rural life. Learning to play the harp had been part of her education in Vienna, one of the accomplishments expected of aristocratic young women. She would gain tones practicing after her marriage, finding in music a form of expression that did not require words, and therefore could not be misinterpreted or used against her politically. The music she played on this harp included popular songs of the period, as well as more serious compositions by masters like Gluck, whose operas she patronized during her years as queen. The act of playing created private moments in a life that offered very little genuine privacy, times when she could focus on the physical challenges of producing beautiful sounds rather than on the constant political and social pressures that characterized her public existence. The servants who heard her practice reported that she played with genuine feeling, not merely going through the mechanical motions of a learned skill. The books from her personal library reveal reading tastes that were broader and more serious than her reputation for frivolity would suggest. She owned copies of philosophical works by Enlightenment thinkers, though whether she actually read them or simply maintained them as part of her library's expected contents remains unclear. She definitely read novels and poetry, genres that were gaining respectability during this period, but were still sometimes dismissed as light entertainment, rather than serious literature. The novels she favored tended towards sentimental stories that emphasized feeling over reason, emotion over calculation. These works celebrated authentic human connection and condemned the artificial social conventions that prevented people from expressing their true selves. Her attraction to such stories makes sense given her own experience of living within systems that demanded constant performance and made genuine self-expression dangerous. The fictional characters who rejected social constraint in favor of emotional authenticity must have appealed to someone whose entire life was governed by protocols she had not chosen. The poetry she read included works by contemporary French poets as well as translations of German and English verse. Some of these poems dealt with themes of nature and rural life, celebrating the simplicity and honesty of pastoral existence in contrast to the corruption and artificiality of court society. Attraction to these pastoral themes found expression in the famous hameau she created near the Petit Trianon, where she could temporarily inhabit a world that resembled the idealized countryside described in the poems she admired. The sometimes books she read to her offspring reveal her commitment to their education and her preferences for stories that taught moral lessons through entertaining narratives. She chose tales that emphasized kindness, honesty, and courage, virtues she hoped her children would develop despite growing up in an environment where such qualities were often liabilities rather than assets. The books showed wear from repeated reading, their pages softened by many turnings, their margins sometimes marked with small notes in her handwriting. The household accounts from her years at Versailles provide detailed records of daily expenditures that modern researchers have used to reconstruct patterns of consumption and display. These documents show spending on an enormous scale, thousands of livres devoted to clothing, jewelry, entertainment, gifts, and the maintenance of multiple residences. Revolutionary propagandists would use these accounts to demonstrate her supposed extravagance and indifference to the economic hardships facing ordinary French subjects. Yet careful analysis of these same accounts reveals a more complicated picture. Much of the spending was not discretionary but required by her position and the ceremonial obligations that came with it. Queens were expected to maintain certain standards of magnificence that demonstrated royal power and prestige. Failing to spend adequately would have been interpreted as insulting to France's dignity and might have created political problems as serious as excessive spending did. She was trapped in a system that required lavish expenditure, while making her personally responsible for costs that served broader political purposes. The accounts also show that she spent considerable sums on charity, providing assistance to poor families and supporting institutions that cared for orphans and the elderly. These charitable expenditures rarely received the same attention as her spending on personal luxuries, but they demonstrated concern for others that contradicted the image of complete selfishness that revolutionary propaganda promoted. The families who received her assistance remembered her generosity even after she had been condemned as an enemy of the people. The gardens at Versailles that she transformed, according to her aesthetic preferences, show her influence on the landscape in ways that survive centuries after her death. The English garden style she favored, with its irregular paths and naturalistic plantings, contrasted sharply with the geometric precision that characterized traditional French garden design. She commissioned these changes because she found the formal gardens oppressive in their rigid perfection, preferring landscapes that appeared to have evolved naturally even though they were actually carefully designed to create that impression. Walking through these gardens today, visitors can see the vision she was trying to realize. The paths wind through groves of trees that seem randomly arranged but were actually positioned to create specific visual effect. Small streams follow courses that appear natural but were engineered to ensure proper water flow. The overall effect is of nature perfected rather than nature controlled, a subtle distinction that reflected her aesthetic philosophy and her desire for environments that allowed some spontaneity and surprise. The grotto she commissioned within these gardens provided a shaded retreat where she could sit during hot summer afternoons, listening to water flowing over rocks while enjoying relief from the relentless sun. The interior was decorated with shells and minerals arranged in patterns that caught and reflected light filtering through the entrance. Sitting in this cool, dim space offered sensory experiences very different from the brilliant visual splendor that characterized the main palace interiors. The Temple of Love, a small classical structure overlooking a lake, served as a destination for walks through the gardens. Its columns and domed roof created a focal point that drew the eye across the water, while its interior housed a sculpture of Cupid that represented love in its most idealized form. She would sometimes sit here with close friends, enjoying conversations that were more intimate and authentic than the carefully managed interactions that characterized court life in the main palace. The Hameau, which became the most controversial of her garden projects, was located at some distance from the Petit Trianon, requiring a walk through landscaped grounds that gradually transitioned from formal to increasingly naturalistic. The approach was designed to create a sense of journey from the artificial world of the court to a space that represented rural authenticity, though of course the entire environment was as carefully constructed as any theatre set. The cottages of the Hameau were built to resemble peasant dwellings but with interiors that provided comforts no actual peasant family could have afforded. The walls were genuinely rustic in appearance, constructed from materials and techniques used in real rural buildings, but the rooms within contained furniture and amenities that revealed the essentially artificial nature of this pastoral fantasy. She could play at being a milkmaid or shepherdess while knowing that servants stood ready to handle any actual work required. The farm animals kept at the Hameau were carefully selected for their appearance and temperament, chosen to be attractive and docile rather than productive. The cows were breeds known for gentle dispositions and pleasing coloring. The sheep had particularly soft wool and would allow themselves to be petted like dogs. The chickens were varieties that produced attractive eggs and presented minimal challenges to someone unfamiliar with actual poultry keeping. This working farm that supported the Hameau was located out of sight, staffed by real farmers who produced the milk and eggs and other products that appeared as if by magic in the rustic buildings where she played at rural life. This hidden infrastructure revealed the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the entire project. It was simultaneously a genuine attempt to connect with simpler, more authentic ways of living, and an elaborate theatre production that depended on exactly the kind of artificial support system she was supposedly trying to escape. The revolutionary propagandists who later used the Hameau as evidence of her disconnection from reality were not entirely wrong in their critique. The project did demonstrate a kind of privileged blindness to the actual conditions of rural poverty that afflicted real French peasants. But it also revealed something more sympathetic, her genuine longing for authenticity and simplicity in a life that offered very little of either. The Hameau was both absurd and poignant, a symbol of her impossible position as someone who could neither fully embrace her royal role, nor successfully escape from it. The staff who served her at the Petit Trianon and the Hameau left accounts that provide insights into her character and daily behavior when she was not performing for the court. These servants described someone who was often kind and considerate, who thanked them for their service and sometimes asked about their families and personal concerns. She learned the names of people who worked for her regularly and remembered details about their lives that demonstrated genuine interest rather than merely polite inquiry. These positive accounts from servants must be balanced against other testimony from people who found her demanding or inconsistent in her treatment of those who served her. Some described her as moody, generous and warm one day, distant and critical the next. The variations likely reflected the enormous pressures she faced, the constant scrutiny and the knowledge that every action would be judged by people looking for reasons to condemn her. The emotional labor of maintaining appropriate queenly demeanor while also trying to be a good person must have been exhausting. The servants who remained loyal to her during her imprisonment and trial risked their own safety to provide what comfort they could. Some smuggled small luxuries into her cell, a better quality of bread or a piece of chocolate, tiny gestures that meant far more than their material value suggested. Others simply treated her with the respect and kindness that her official captors deliberately withheld, addressing her with courtesy titles and maintaining the fiction that she retained some dignity despite her circumstances. The transformation of public opinion about her character began almost immediately after her execution. People who had enthusiastically supported her destruction found themselves experiencing unexpected guilt or remorse. The accounts left by spectators who witnessed her final journey to the scaffold frequently mentioned being moved by her composure and dignity. Some described feeling ashamed of their previous enthusiasm for her punishment once they saw the reality of an aging woman facing death with remarkable courage. This shift in sentiment did not happen uniformly or completely. Many remained convinced that her execution had been necessary and just, but enough people experienced doubts about revolutionary justice that her memory became a site of contested meaning almost immediately. Was she a victim or a criminal? A martyr? Or a justly punished enemy of the people? These questions could not be answered definitively because they depended on prior commitments about the legitimacy of revolution itself. The children she left behind became living symbols of the revolution's complicated legacy. Her daughter Marie Therese survived imprisonment and was eventually released as part of a prisoner exchange. The young woman who emerged from captivity bore little resemblance to the child who had been separated from her mother. Years of harsh treatment and psychological trauma had transformed her into someone whose entire personality was shaped by suffering and loss. Marie Therese's memoirs, written many years after the events they described, provided detailed accounts of her mother's behavior during the family's imprisonment. She remembered her mother's attempts to maintain normal routines despite impossible circumstances, her efforts to protect her children from fully understanding the dangers they faced, her quiet dignity in the face of escalating persecution. These memories, filtered through years of grief and political rehabilitation of the monarchy, portrayed Marie Antoinette as an almost saintly figure whose every action demonstrated maternal love and Christian virtue. The son she had hoped would someday become Louis XVII died in prison under circumstances that remained controversial for generations. The official account claimed he succumbed to tuberculosis, but rumors persisted that he had been deliberately mistreated or even murdered by captors who wanted to eliminate any potential focus for monarchist restoration efforts. The truth about his death probably fell somewhere between deliberate murder and callous neglect, the guards simply failing to provide adequate care for a child they had been taught to view as the offspring of enemies. Marie Antoinette never knew the fate of her son, dying months before he did. Her final months were haunted by fears about what might be happening to her children, the uncertainty perhaps worse than any definitive knowledge would have been. She had written to them in letters that were never delivered, expressing love and offering advice she hoped might guide them if they survived to adulthood. These letters, preserved by people who intercepted them, show a mother's desperate attempt to maintain connection across the barriers of imprisonment and looming death. The physical spaces where she spent her final days have been preserved as sites of memory that attract visitors interested in understanding the human dimensions of revolutionary justice. The cell in the conciergerie where she lived out her last weeks has been maintained in something approximating its appearance during her imprisonment. The stone walls, the small window, the plain furniture, all combine to create an environment that helps contemporary visitors understand the harsh conditions she endured. Standing in that cell today, one can sense the weight of history that saturates the space. The air feels heavy with accumulated sorrow, though whether this is objective reality or psychological projection remains impossible to determine. Visitors often report feeling moved in ways they did not anticipate, the physical reality of the small cramped space making her suffering more concrete and comprehensible than any written description could achieve. The chapel that now marks her gravesite provides a very different kind of memorial space, designed to honor her memory and provide a place for quiet reflection rather than to recreate the harsh conditions of her final imprisonment. The simple monument emphasizes her humanity rather than her royal status, the inscription identifying her by name and dates without elaborate titles or claims about her character. This restraint seems appropriate for someone whose life demonstrated that royal status provided neither protection from suffering nor guarantee of posthumous honor. The flowers that appear regularly at her grave demonstrate that she continues to inspire sympathy and interest more than 2 centuries after her death. Some visitors leave elaborate arrangements, while others simply place a single stem, but all participate in a ritual of remembrance that connects past and present. These small acts of commemoration by anonymous individuals create a kind of democratic memorial that exists alongside and sometimes in tension with official historical interpretations. The prayers written on small cards and left at the chapel reveal the range of meanings that people find in her story. Some pray for her soul, expressing traditional Catholic beliefs about the need for intercession on behalf of the dead. Others write messages of sympathy or apology, as if trying to make amends for injustices she suffered centuries before they were born. Still others leave notes that connect her experience to their own struggles, finding in her story resonance with their personal challenges and sorrows. The anniversary commemorations of her execution draw varying numbers of participants, depending on the political climate and current events that might make her story seem more or less relevant. Some years the ceremonies are small, attended only by dedicated monarchists and historical enthusiasts. Other years, when revolutionary violence or questions about justice happen to be prominent in public discourse, larger crowds gather, finding in her death a focal point for reflecting on contemporary concerns about political extremism and the treatment of those designated as enemies. The academic conferences devoted to studying her life and times continue to produce new scholarship that refines understanding of her historical significance, while also revealing how much remains unknown or ambiguous about her character and conduct. Historians debate the reliability of various sources, the proper interpretation of her letters and recorded statements, the extent to which her behavior was shaped by personal choice versus the constraints of her position. These debates demonstrate that historical knowledge is always provisional and subject to revision as new evidence emerges or new interpretative frameworks are developed. The museum exhibitions that feature artifacts from her life must make difficult choices about how to present objects that carry complex and sometimes contradictory meanings. A dress that she wore to a court ball can be displayed as an example of 18th century fashion and craftsmanship, as evidence of the luxury that characterized life at Versailles, as a symbol of the excess that fueled revolutionary anger, or as a poignant reminder of a woman who once inhabited this beautiful garment and is now long dead. Each choice about labeling and contextualization shapes how visitors understand the object and the person who once owned it. The challenge for curators is to provide enough historical context for visitors to understand the significance of what they are seeing while avoiding either romanticization of aristocratic privilege. The goal is to present her as a complex human being whose life raised important questions about power, privilege, justice, and the limits of individual agency within oppressive systems. Achieving this balance requires careful attention to language and presentation strategies that acknowledge multiple valid perspectives while maintaining historical accuracy. The educational programs developed around these exhibitions show particular care in addressing young visitors who might be encountering her story for the first time. The programs emphasize that she was a real person, not a fairy tale character, and that understanding her life requires grappling with difficult questions that do not have simple answers. Students are encouraged to examine primary sources, to consider different interpretations of the same events, to recognize their own assumptions and how those shape their understanding of the past. These educational efforts aim to develop critical thinking skills, while also fostering empathy for people whose experiences differ dramatically from anything most students will ever encounter. The hope is that engaging seriously with Marie Antoinette's story will help young people understand both the contingency of historical events and the persistence of certain human experiences across time and culture. Her life demonstrates how individual choices and structural constraints interact in ways that make assigning responsibility The theatrical productions that continue to dramatize her story face similar challenges in balancing entertainment with historical responsibility. Playwrights must decide how to portray her character, what aspects of her biography to emphasize, how to represent the revolutionary forces that destroyed her without either demonizing them or minimizing the violence they committed. The most successful productions recognize that her story contains genuine tragedy that does not require embellishment or melodrama to achieve emotional impact. The actors who take on the role of Marie Antoinette describe the challenges of portraying someone who existed simultaneously as a real historical person and as a powerful symbolic figure. They must find ways to convey her humanity while also acknowledging the mythic dimensions that her story has acquired through centuries of retelling. The best performances achieve a balance that allows audiences to see her as both an individual woman facing specific circumstances and as a representative figure whose fate illuminates broader truths about power and its loss. The operatic treatments of her life allow composers to explore the emotional dimensions of her story through music that can express feelings that words alone cannot capture. The arias written for the character of Marie Antoinette often emphasize her isolation, her longing for authentic connection, her ultimate acceptance of her fate. These musical moments provide opportunities for emotional catharsis that can help audiences process the tragic dimensions of her story. The ballet versions of her story use movement and visual spectacle to convey the progression from youthful innocence through mature complexity to final dignity. The choreography often contrasts the elaborate court dances of Versailles with the harsh simplicity of her imprisonment, using physical vocabulary to demonstrate the complete transformation of her circumstances. The most effective ballet interpretations find ways to suggest her inner life through gesture and movement that transcend the limitations of narrative ballet's reliance on pantomime. The films that continue to be made about her life demonstrate the enduring fascination that her story holds for contemporary audiences. Each new cinematic interpretation reflects the concerns and perspectives of its own historical moment, while attempting to illuminate aspects of her experience that previous versions neglected or misunderstood. The accumulation of these different film versions creates a kind of collective portrait that captures something of her complexity through its very multiplicity of perspectives. As night deepens and sleep beckons more insistently, we can carry with us the knowledge that Marie Antoinette's story continues to unfold through countless acts of remembrance and interpretation. The young woman who left Vienna with such hope and excitement could never have imagined the extraordinary afterlife her memory would enjoy, the ways that her name would continue to provoke discussion and reflection across centuries and continents. Her remarkable journey teaches us that history is never simply about facts and dates, but always about human beings whose choices and sufferings continue to illuminate our own struggles to live with dignity and purpose in circumstances we cannot fully control.